My name's Andy Small. I'm a former teacher of 16 years across state and independent sectors, having joined the company 3 years ago as part of what was then an early iteration of our Assessment Insights team. I now work with our independent schools and oversee provision of GL assessments, tests and surveys in the sector. I remain passionate about supporting colleagues to get the most out of their data to drive school improvement, and ultimately that's what this session is all about. A few pieces of housekeeping before we start. If anyone is unable to hear me, then you won't, of course, hear this. But if you do have any other technical issues, then please pop these in the chat function and share them with my colleague Suzanne. She'll be able to help you in the background. We'd also politely ask that everybody stays on mute for the course of the main presentation. Any comments or questions that you have, either for myself or our speaker today, if you could post those in the Q&A panel, then we'll review those as we go. And we do anticipate having some time to respond to questions at the end of our session this afternoon. As you are already aware, the session is being recorded today, and that recording will be shared with you and those other colleagues who are registered but unable to join the call live in due course. So our session today focuses on two of GL's flagship assessments, the Cognitive Abilities Test CAT4 and PASS, the Pupil Attitudes to Self and School Survey. I'm really delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Andrew Crookall, who is Assistant Head Teacher of Stamford Senior School, and it's Dr. Crookall who will be giving the lion's share of the input today. At Stamford, CAT4 and PASS are key tools, not only in their own right, but also in combination. For those of you unfamiliar with the assessment, the Cognitive Abilities Test is widely used across the sector as a baseline test of students' developed abilities across 4 key areas known to make a difference to learning. Not only are the test results highly reliable, but they also give rise to incredibly detailed reports, indicative grades of potential future attainment, and allow schools to obtain a verified measure of value added via our fairly recently added GL and Fisher Family Trust value added dashboards. CAT4 was rigorously standardized. It's verified against huge numbers of students every year. Feedback from schools highlights the validity of the data, the impressive range of reports for different audiences, and the valuable, easily accessible support from our team. If you're not yet using CAT4, then we'd love your colleagues and yourselves to benefit from the data it can produce. So we're offering a free trial of the assessment with your students in the spring term. Do reach out to me for more information. I'll share my contact details, which are in the bottom right of the screen there, again at the end of the webinar. Dr. Crookall will also share with us how he makes use of PASS data together with his CAT4 baseline information. Now, PASS is a tool that helps take the guesswork out of understanding what makes some students tick. In the equivalent of a form period, that was the time in which I used to administer PASS surveys, significant volumes of data can be gleaned to provide insights into valuable aspects of students' well-being, and also an insight into sort of a school's climate and culture. So where identifying potentially vulnerable learners is concerned, PASS is a go-to tool for so many schools across the sector, and it comes with our online PASS interventions tool, which now includes in excess of 70 ready-made intervention ideas for you to employ. But I think that is probably enough of a sales pitch for anybody this afternoon. As I say, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Andrew Crookall today, whom you may have heard speak at this year's Festival of Education if you're at Wellington School in the summer. Joining the profession after a career in industry, Dr. Crookall shares my own passion for making use of data, making effective use of the data that's generated in schools, and he's going to share with us this afternoon his own school's approach to making CAT4 and PASS data work for him and his students. So I will go quiet now and pass over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we now have a screen that you can all see, which
we do.
Has a title. Excellent. Right. Well, I want to share something of a data journey with you, and it almost starting with the conclusions. What I want to say at the outset is that data is something that should lead us towards conversations rather than conclusions. It's dangerous to take the data in isolation. So everything that I'm talking about is intended to take us towards being able to have the right conversations with the right people to be able to know what to do next, rather than taking the data at face value and not having those deeper understanding conversations. So data should lead us to conversations, not conclusions. But actually, most schools have more data than they can handle, and typically don't know what they can do with that data. So actually the starting point really needs to be to start to decide what it is you really want to know. So we started from that point of view of wanting to know what questions we wanted our data to answer. And then we asked questions like, have we got the right data to answer those questions, and what data are we going to need to do it? But the questions that we wanted answers to, and I'd suggest most schools would like answers to, are things like, which students are furthest away from achieving in line with their potential, and indeed which students are exceeding expectations by the most, who are the ones that really need to be recognized for the achievements that they're making. Have we got students that are that think they're doing really badly but actually aren't? Have we got students who are academically anxious? Have we got, conversely, students who are underperforming but actually think they're doing perfectly okay and need a little bit of a wake-up call? Have we got groups of students where we really ought to be able to say how they're doing relative to their peers? For example, those with special educational needs or disabilities, those who have English as an additional language. And there are other student groups we might pick on there, but can we compare those to the rest of the cohort? And then some of the slightly more complicated questions. Are we getting the balance right between support for our weakest students and stretching our most able students? If we've got a finite amount of capability to work with our students beyond the teaching and lessons, are we getting that balance right? Can we tell the difference between students' ability and the effort they're making? And that's tricky, but it is possible. And are our students genuinely being stretched and challenged? Is there anything we can do with our data to give us some clues as to the extent to which a year group is being stretched and challenged? And to a lesser or greater extent, it is possible to answer all of those questions using data. So what data do we need? So the data that we use to do this is we start with current attainment grades, and those are the grades that our teachers are awarding students in each subject at their regular testing points. And of course, to make that work, we need to be confident that different classes are using the same reasonably standardized tests and that they're using them reasonably regularly. So there is a program of work before we can really use data meaningfully to make sure that we've got reliable data from each different teacher, from each different class, and that you know, when we say somebody's attaining at a certain level, that actually it means the same thing when applied to different students in the same year group. So there's an education and a standardization kind of task to do there. It's not trivial, but once you've done it, you can really start to get some benefits from it. But we also give approach to learning grades, and approach to learning grades, you might call them effort grades, but these are a sort of holistic, we use a sort of 5-to-1 number scale, but you might class them as excellent, good, secure, cause for concern, I don't know, something like that, but some sort of measure of the students' engagement with their learning, the level of independence in their learning, the level of organization that they're showing, whether they hit deadlines, all of those sorts of factors all wrap up in what we call approach to learning grades. And of course, from whichever MIS you're using, if you want to look at individual groups of students, you'll need some sort of data that tells you who's in which student group. So that's the stuff that doesn't come from GL. It'd be nice if it all came in one place, but it doesn't. The stuff that does come from GL that we can weave in with this, we're going to use the mean standardized age scores from the CAT4 data. It's quite interesting to explore further and use the strand scores, but actually we still find the mean standardized age scores are the most useful measures. We're going to use indicated grades that we get. We call them that, but these are the grades that students have historically achieved most likely, or if challenged, you take your pick as to which ones you think are most appropriate for your school. But these are the grades that students with the same ability profile have achieved historically. A word on that, it's probably a bad idea to view those as targets, because of course you'd hope for half of your students to be exceeding those grades. In fact, you'd hope for all your students to be exceeding those grades. But if they're viewed as targets, that can be a little bit limited. They're measures of expectation, or measures against which expectation can be set. So, you know, if you are hitting your indicated grade, then you're meeting expectations. If you've exceeded your indicated grade, you're above expectations. If you haven't yet hit your indicated grade, then you are not yet meeting expectations, to be all very growth mindset about it. But that's tends to be the way we use indicated grades. And of course, the pupils' approach to self and school data, the past data that's already been mentioned. And we'll look in a little bit more detail about how we use that. But with that collection of data, we can do a lot. So here's a little summary of the process by which we use this data. So we have data coming in from these regular assessments, and we also have data coming in the form of the baseline assessments, and data coming in the form of PASS. Those are the red boxes, the inputs to the process. We have an agreed calendar, and you will as well, of reporting points at which reports are sent out to parents. And we simply use that reporting to parents to trigger an internal reporting process as well. So whenever data is collected to go home, we also process it internally. And really what most of this talk is around is the yellow box, which is visualizations. How do we use that data to help us answer those questions? But like I said, the data in itself is potentially dangerous if you don't really understand the context. And so all of those visualizations go for us into a review meeting where we sit and talk about those students that the data says are most interesting. And we try and find out what's going on with them. What are we doing already? What else could we do? So that's the process in which this collection of data is being used. Let's now start to have a look at what sorts of uses or visualizations we do with this data. Okay, so here is a first example of a way I might choose to arrange my data. I should say at this point you are seeing student names, but you're not seeing real student names. All those come from an online database of randomized names. So it's real data, but it's not real names. And this is a profile of a year group. We've got, well, you can see a dot for each student. And along the bottom axis, the x-axis, we have the mean standardized age score from CAT4. And up the y-axis, we have their average attainment grade. So in the most recent set of tests, I've averaged what they've got in each subject, and I've got a score there. This happens to be a GCSE group, so it's on a 9-to-1 scale there. And really, the simplistic level, what that tells me is that my most potentially able students are the ones who are attaining the higher grades. Well, I kind of expect that, but at the same time, it's refreshing to know that that correlation is there, because that's actually telling me that our teaching program is working to some extent. But actually, the use in this data is when you start to put some upper and lower limits on it, parallel to that line of best fit, and you start to look at those students who are most furthest above the line of best fit for this cohort. Who are the students who are getting attainment grades that are significantly above average for their particular ability? Because those are the ones who you ought to be recognizing and rewarding for the good grades that they're getting. And perhaps more importantly, given what we're really talking about here, who's falling below the red line? Who are those students who, for their ability, are a significant way below the mean for this cohort? And those are the students who we should be having individual conversations about. So I can immediately pick out well, in this data set, about 6 or 7 students who I want to be having more detailed conversations about. And if we weren't looking at the data in this way, some of the students who are quite able but actually underperforming here are some of the students who we might miss. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with their grades. It's just they're a long way below where their grades should be, even though they're sort of middle sort of grades for the year group. So it helps us to pick out those students who are genuinely underperforming, even if theirs aren't the lowest scores in the year group. And of course, we can then pick out individuals within a group and see how those are doing. So this is the same sort of plot, the same axes, same meaning, but now I've simply highlighted those students for whom English is an additional language. And I can start to ask questions about, are my EAL students in any way disadvantaged compared to the cohort? And that data would suggest not. In fact, there's nobody there who is outside of the scatter of the main data. So I would say that my EAL teachers are doing a good job at making sure that all my EAL students can access the curriculum in the way that I would want. And of course, you can do exactly the same thing for your SEND students, or your gifted and talented, or scholars, or boarders, or whatever other student groups you think you might be interested in exploring. So this is really just using the mean standardized age scores and the average attainment grades from your teachers to get a first view of a cohort. And alongside that, we might use either of these or both of these sorts of data visualizations just to support that data. So over on the right, what I'm looking at there is simply how far above or below the indicated grade is the current grade for each student. So I can very quickly use that to get a feel for, if I've got an individual student, are they underperforming in all their subjects, or is there one particular subject where I ought to be more concerned? Do I need a conversation with all of their teachers about how to support them, or are there particular departments where I might need to go back and explore what's going on there? So it gives me a way of digging into more detail as to why a student might be underperforming and how widespread that is. And then the little bar chart over on the left is simply me taking the average attainment at their last reporting point and at the current reporting point and looking at the differences for those students where it's changed significantly. So who are my students at either end of the spectrum? Who's managed to pull off a significant achievement in improving, or who's fallen behind? And again, at the extremes of that data, I would want to be having conversations about what's changed. Is there a pastoral story there? Is there an issue emerging in terms of relationship, or emerging with relationship with the teacher? There's all sorts of possibilities as to what sorts of things might be causing those changes. Moving on, we talked, this is the same data as you looked at in my very first slide before you think I'm showing you anything new, because I wanted to highlight what happens when you move from a younger cohort to an older cohort. You were looking here at a year 9 cohort, I think, but on exactly the same axis scales, look what happens when you profile a 6th form cohort. It's really interesting the way that changes. And I'm reasonably convinced that what's happening here is a transition between the students' ability, students' achievement depending on their ability, and students' achievement depending on their effort. As we get to 6th form, I think as students have now chosen subjects that they're particularly interested in, actually their attainment now depends much more on how hard they're willing to work and how they push themselves, and rather less on how innately able are they, how their potential ability shows up. And it's not unusual to see the 6th form data scatter much more like this, and the line of best fit across a cohort become much less steep. So we start to think about, with 6th form, well, what sort of data might give us better insights if this is really scattered? And indeed, what looks like it's worth exploring is actually the approach to learning or effort grades. So if we move to those, this is the approach to learning data for my cohort. And I wasn't expecting to see a correlation there for two reasons. Well, firstly, because with this kind of data, you wouldn't expect a student's effort to be correlated in any way with their potential ability. It shouldn't be. So I wanted to see that the data was scattered. But also what I want to see is how scattered is it? Because actually, if the data is all in the same place, I'm not really in any meaningful way measuring students' effort. And my teachers are not producing a measure that I can work with. But if I've got lots and lots of scatter here, actually, this is telling me quite useful stories about which of my students are really pushing themselves hardest and which of my students are cruising. Or at least teachers' perceptions of that. There may be more to the story, as we've said already. And again, I can put a couple of lines in here and pick out those students who are viewed as having the most pleasing approach to learning, and those students who might need some help with their approach to learning. And indeed, we can start to put interventions in place to help those students whose approach to learning seems to be furthest below what it could be. They might need some study skills kind of help. They might need some academic mentoring or something of that kind. So firstly, yeah, that line of best fit should be nearly horizontal. In fact, one of the questions I wanted to answer earlier on is whether my staff can actually tell the difference between effort and ability. And the gradient of this line is a measure of whether my staff really know the difference between a student's effort and a student's innate ability. You know, if you do this plot with much younger classes, you do seem to see a steeper gradient to the line. There's much more evidence that staff will give high effort grades to those who are attaining highly, rather than those who are showing evidence of doing anything above and beyond or anything unusual in terms of their approach to learning. So degree of scatter reflects the level of demand of the work. The more demanding the work is, and of course A-level work is much more demanding, the more you see that scatter, simply because different students will respond differently to the challenge that's being made on them. And of course, I said that this scatter can disappear with younger age groups. Again, on the same sort of scale, that's moved to a year 9 group. And you see now, I would start to be quite concerned about that data if I saw that. That's telling me that my teaching staff think that all of the students in that year group are good or excellent in all their subjects. And I'm just not quite willing to believe that that's true. So the other thing I'm seeing is a greater slope in the line of best fit. So my first suspicion is that teachers are not really looking at effort here. They're looking at what students have attained and assuming that the effort correlates with that. But the other thing I'm wondering about is if I'm really seeing all my students achieving at much the same level, is that because they're not being stretched enough? Is there insufficient challenge being put on that year group to really see a student's effort emerge from the picture? There is another possible explanation in here as well, which is the sort of teachers avoiding conflict possibility, that teaching staff are overinflating the approach to learning grades so as not to be giving bad news and having to have uncomfortable conversations. And I'm not suggesting that would happen routinely, but there may be an element of that when you see data like this as well. And it just gives you a feel for what's happening in a year group. We can use similar sorts of data to look at what happens with SEN provision. So I've got my data points split up into 3 groups here. So those students who are not SEN are the blue diamonds. Those students who get support from teaching assistants in lessons are my red squares. And those students who get out of curriculum learning support are my green triangles. And I can start to look at whether the provision for them is closing the gap or not. And it's reasonably clear that those who are wave 1, who are getting in-lesson support, are not viewed by staff as having any difference in their approach to learning to the rest of the year group. But actually my wave 2 to 3 students, staff don't perceive as making the same degree of commitment to their studies. And that's quite interesting. That's worth exploring with the Learning Support Department, whether that's genuinely the case for this group of students, or whether staff don't understand the particular special needs of those students sufficiently to be able to discriminate between the results they're getting and the effort they're making to get those results. So we can start to explore data like that using these sorts of plots. So we've talked so far, all our plots have had the potential ability of the students by measured as mean SAS along the bottom axis, and then some measure of attainment or approach to learning up the other axis. But it doesn't need to be like that all the time. We can do plots like this, still got the mean SAS on the bottom axis, but now what I'm doing is looking at the sum of the differences between current and indicated grades. So I'm looking at overall our students on target, in which case I'd expect them to be on the 0 line. How many of my students are producing results that are in excess of their indicated grade, so they'd have a positive value here, and how many of my students overall are falling behind expectations. And of course it would be great to see all of the students above the 0 line, but we see 1 or 2 who aren't. And so the kinds of questions I'm interested in with this data is what's the balance here? What's the gradient look like? Have I supported my weakest students at the extent of not stretching and challenging my most able students? And I can start to see from that gradient that possibly I need to readdress that balance for this particular year group to try and make sure that the most able students are actually pushing up towards their full potential, because it's the more able students who appear to be the ones that are underperforming in this particular year group. This was a year 7 cohort for interest. I also have a suspicion with a young cohort like this that, again, there may be sort of non-linear grade boundaries here. There may be some overinflation of the lowest grades. Again, possibly an avoiding bad news kind of scenario. So I'd want to have conversations with heads of department and with teaching staff about which of these possible scenarios for why the data looks like this they think is realistic, and do we need to readdress anything there. The other thing that we can do, and this is the first time I've changed our x-axis, is I can keep the same y-axis, which is my measure of to what extent are students exceeding or falling behind expectations. And I can plot the approach to learning grades that teachers have given me along the x-axis. And so now my x-axis is how effectively do staff think students are working, how hard are they working, and my y-axis is how far ahead of expectations are they. And so what we'd expect, what we'd like to see, is all of our students occupying the top right corner of this graph. But the interesting places are what happens when we start to look up into the top right and top left and bottom right corners. So firstly, all of those students in the green area here are students who are on average exceeding or meeting expectations, and my pink students are the ones who aren't at this point in time. That's an easy visualization to make from this data. But like I said, what I'm really interested in are those students who lie furthest away from the line of best fit in this direction, because these are students who are potentially exceeding expectations, but staff perceive as making relatively low effort. Why? What's going on with those students? Again, conversation time. Is it that those students are actually really quite able, they're getting great results, but they're bored rigid, they're not being stretched and challenged? What other possible explanations? There are many different reasons students might be up here. And then over in this corner, I've got students who staff believe and perceive as working really hard, but actually are still attaining grades that are below expectation. And it's worth exploring their individual reasons for that. There are a number of possible reasons. One might be that a student has been underperforming and not working very hard, but has recently realized that they need to make a change and are now working very, very hard to recover the situation, but it hasn't got their grades back where they should be yet. So it could well be that a student is moving in the right direction. It could be that, again, a set of teachers are avoiding bad news and are giving approach to learning grades or effort grades that are a little bit inflated for what that student is really achieving. So I find this quite a useful visualization to try and understand both the cohort of students and the way staff are interacting with them. Moving on to the past data then. So in the introduction, Andy talked about how PASS produces essentially 9 different areas of rating different students' measures of themselves. Things like their feelings about school, their preparedness for learning, and so on. And what we do is we group those into 3 groups. Factor 4 and factor 9, preparedness for learning and response to curriculum demands, we take as a measure of students' engagement with their learning. And then the blue ones, perceived learning capability, self-regard as a learner, and confidence in learning, we group and call their self-perception of their learning competence. And the remaining ones we view as being contextual factors. And actually, I don't do anything with the remaining ones. All our analysis is based on the yellow and the blue here. And what we do to visualize that data is to plot it against this difference between attainment and indicated grades again. So this same axis we've been talking about as if students are on 0, they're meeting expectations. If they're above 0, then they're exceeding expectations. But we're now plotting against their self-perception, in this case of their engagement with their learning. And again, I'm not looking for a correlation. This is a quadrant plot, and I would really like to see all of my students occupying the top right corner, where they perceived as engaged with their learning and they're exceeding expectations. That's great. And I've got a decent number of students there. I'm happy with that. That's my doing fine corner. Moving around to the other quadrants though, over on the top left, I've got the corner where students are doing very nicely in terms of exceeding expectations, but actually they don't rate themselves as engaged with their learning. And again, I'd like to have some conversations with those students about why that might be, and indeed with their teaching staff. Is it an academic insecurity thing? Is it that they are experiencing extreme pressure to be very highly achieving and they just don't believe they can live up to the pressure that's being placed upon them? Do they see themselves as disengaged with their learning because, again, they're bored, they don't see themselves as being stretched or challenged by their schoolwork? There'll be a story in there that's worth exploring. In the bottom right quadrant, we've got complacency corner. This is where we would find students who are underperforming but rate themselves as very engaged with their learning. They may need no more than a wake-up call and a conversation that says, well, what you think is engaged with your learning, really good engagement with learning looks like this. How do you measure up against that? Could you make some changes? Or it may well be that, again, these are students who are not yet attaining the results they would like, but have already started to make a change and are pushing themselves now, but weren't previously. And then bottom left, we've got the corner where we really do need to be concerned about these students. They're struggling and they know they are. And these are the students where we can start to put in place interventions such as academic mentoring and real support for those students, because they're going to be open to being helped. And we can do exactly the same thing with those learning competence scores. It's exactly the same sort of quadrant plot with much the same meanings to the quadrants. But this is now students' perception of how able they are as learners. And where we've got students who are struggling with their learning competence, it may well be that some sort of study skills intervention for a few weeks is able to make a significant difference for them. But we can see who are those students who are genuinely struggling with their learning competence, and those students who are actually doing fine but think they aren't competent learners, who might want something different. They may well need nothing more than reassurance from perhaps a more able student who has been through it all before them and understands that actually they're doing okay and it will be okay. So we've talked quite a bit about types of data and the way we can put those together and visualize it. And really, now that we've done the yellow box here and we've got decent collections of data, it opens the door for that review meeting. And the review meeting for us at Stanford would be senior leadership team members from the academic senior leadership team, along with our SENCO, along with our head of year. And typically that small team can go through and share viewpoints on any one of those students who in the data we determined was a cause for concern or somebody that we needed to understand more about. And our aim in those meetings is always to understand what interventions are already in place for that student, if any, and what new interventions could we try out. We've been doing this for a couple of years now, and to give you an idea of whether there's any real benefit, this is our data for the last academic year. So the headline over that is that we had conversations about 240 students last year in those different meetings. And for those 240 students, we were able to find something that wasn't already being done for about 30% of those students. And so we could try something new for those. And by the end of the year, 42% of those 240 students were no longer a cause for concern. Some of them this won't, you know, it'll help in the right direction, but there'll still be problems to resolve. Some of those stories are not ones that you can resolve by easy means or over a short time scale. But actually, that for me is evidence of an impact that I think makes this kind of data visualization worthwhile. And I will leave it there. And having sown some seeds for thought, I'm more than happy to pick up questions or discuss any of this with anybody who wants to. So I'll just stop sharing.
Andrew, thank you. That was both thought-provoking and very thorough. Fantastic. Really like the way in which you brought the data to life in your visualizations. There have been a couple of questions, okay. And I've got a couple of others if that's not eating into other people's time, but we will see. The first of those questions is around the logistics of producing the visualizations that you've got. Do you have any preferred program? Do you use Excel for what you've just presented, or are there something else, something more sophisticated perhaps that you use? How do you go about producing those visualizations?
Okay, so the visualizations you saw were produced in Excel, and I have used Excel whilst I've been building and stabilizing what the different visualizations will be, just for the flexibility of it. But it is a reasonably time-consuming and manual-ish process in Excel, and therefore the future is probably Power BI. Where I think we're going once we know exactly what our visualizations are is to build a Power BI dashboard that draws both the GL data and the data from our MIS. And if not producing all those visualization, at least gives me all the data I need in one place, in one form. So that's work in progress at the moment. I'm hope within the next sort of few months to be able to take some of the manual out of this process. And phase 2 is how far can I automate it? Unless, of course, somebody like GL goes, oh, there's an opportunity here and we should produce something like this. In which case you could save me a lot of work.
It's funny you should say that, because I'm going to talk a little bit about our GL data dashboards that have in the last 7 days gone live in beta form in TestWise accounts. We'll maybe revisit that in a moment. Thank you. And if anybody else has any other questions they want to type into the Q&A function, then do. I've got a question here that I have my own answer to, but I would like to hear your own as well, Andrew, in terms of your experience at Stanford. It's a school that currently uses an alternative assessment to Cat4, and they wonder how frequently you make use of the cognitive abilities test and also PASS. Is it an annual thing? Is it more frequent than that? Or is it that you use Cat4 particularly maybe with particular year groups?
Yeah. We use Cat4 as part of our entrance process. So when students are moving from junior school into the senior school, we'll use it then. After then, we use it every other year. So my year 8s, my year 10s and my year 12s will do Cat4, and I'll use that data for a 2-year window. Could do it more frequently, but actually I think that's enough. Once per key stage is giving me data. What I have done, though, is to look at how the data is changing over time for a particular group of students, and whether or not, you know, what extent should I be seeing significant differences. And actually, the Cat4 data is pretty stable. So, you know, data that I have on a student in year 8, for a very, very small number of students, would I expect to see anything drastically different from that in year 10 or indeed year 10 to year 12. There are differences, you'd expect that. Not everybody develops in the same way and at the same rate, but actually they are relatively minor, and that gives me some confidence that this data is measuring something real and not random.
And I would say that that is absolutely the picture that we see nationally as well. I would share, sorry, Andrew, what you've just said around my own experience using Cat4 in schools, and mine was with younger students, and we did exactly the same model. We used Cat4 every couple of years. To answer Patricia's question directly, she references a model of year 7, year 10, and year 12, and that is a very, very common model for the use of Cat4 as well. How about PASS?
PASS data, I do that termly. So I'm looking for much more immediacy out of that. I want to get a snapshot of where my students are right now. So yeah, termly with that. There are occasional exceptions. For example, when year 11 and year 13 are getting towards the end of school, I probably won't try and do it in the last term with them. But in general, each term. And I try not to do it on the first day back after a holiday, because I don't believe that's particularly representative, nor will I do it on the last day of term, because everything's red and orange and everybody's way too tired to give you a reasonable view. So choosing the timing of PASS is quite reasonable. But it's a really, really short test. You know, a set of survey, it's not even a test. But it's something that they can do in a few minutes in a tutor time without affecting anything else. So it's easy to do frequently.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, looking at how our schools use it across the sector, I would say that the majority of schools tend to make use of PASS perhaps a couple of times a year. Yeah, what you've just said completely rings true. There tends to be a little bit of a popularity around this time of year, actually, when students have had sufficient numbers of weeks to settle into a new year group or into a new setting. And then a very popular model will be to then revisit PASS in the summer term, perhaps a good 8 weeks or so ahead of transition as well. And many schools will make use of PASS with all students at those times, and then perhaps in the intervening sort of middle term, maybe they will revisit it with individuals for whom they have established intervention, for example, as well. You spoke very clearly about that as well. Another question has come in around how this can be applied to younger students, so students in Key Stage 2, for example, and also to students with SEND. Andrew, I appreciate that your experience may be more at Key Stage 3, 4, and 5, but if you have any experience of Key Stage 2, please do share it, and also any students with special educational needs and disabilities.
Sure. Well, as far as Key Stage 2 is concerned, there is no reason why exactly the same sorts of visualizations won't work. We do have a junior school, and the junior school does use Cat4 and PASS. in fact, what I was showing is quite generic. I would think with the junior school, the trick will be getting reasonable data for the sort of current attainment. And in fact, surprise, GL has some tools there that might just help you in terms of using some of the PTS, PTM, PTE types of tests, if you want to use something standardized, just to get scores that you can plot in that way, that all the year group are doing something more standardized rather than different teachers in different classes doing that assessment in a different way. So yes, perfectly feasible to do something with those younger key stages. And I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to pull the same kind of data and the same sort of conclusions out of the data. SEND, yes. Well, I made reference to that a few times during the talk. But one thing that I haven't mentioned, with SEND, it's well worth going back to the strand scores and having a look at the individual strand scores to try and understand more of where a student is coming from. Are they, is there any particular bias in there? Are there particular strengths that you can work with and build on? If they have a particularly high spatial or a particularly high quant. And indeed, comparing things like their verbal and non-verbal scores will give you some interesting clues. There's a rather nice website on this, actually, if you go and hunt around on interpreting GL Cat4 data. It's not a GL website, but there's some quite nice work being done on what you can do with the strand scores and what conclusions you can draw about what differences are telling you, like the difference between verbal and non-verbal is telling you something about whether students are limited in their ability to put their understanding into words if their vocabulary is not yet supporting them sufficiently to be able to demonstrate their understanding, or conversely, if they can talk a good talk and use it to hide their lack of understanding. So there are some interesting things you can explore there within the strand scores. And we do use those plots where I pull the SEN wave 1 and wave 2 and 3 students out as separate groups to look at whether the kind of support we're providing them is sufficient in each year group, whether it's allowing the gap to close. And I have regular conversations with the SENCO and the Learning Support Department about how do we deal with that, what's the data telling us, and how does it allow us to fine-tune our offerings.
You mentioned a website. Is it by any chance the Mona Lisa Effect and the work that Matt Savage does internationally? I know Matthew Savage is a large exponent of our tests and surveys. I'd also say at this point that GL Assessment has an Assessment Insights team, a team of former teachers. It was the team that I initially joined the company to be a part of. And for any schools using any of our assessments, an Assessment Insights data consultation or multiple consultations are included with your purchase, and our team of experts would be very, very happy to consult with you, talk with you about what the data does mean. One of the big things that the Assessment Insights team is keen to push is drilling down into that Cat4 data beyond the mean SAS, because as Andrew has just said, there is so much richness to that data and a lot of insight that can be gleaned from it. We also have our own Cat4 publications to look at what can be done with the data beyond that as well.
Mm. Yeah, the website I was referring to is actually WAGOLL Teaching, WAGOLL.
What a good one looks like. Thank you. Very good. You also mentioned about how you review this. This is a question from me. Yep. How you review this at sort of at leadership level, and obviously you retain ownership of a lot of what you've shared as well. How engaged are form teachers, subject staff in this, and do you have any tips for sort of promoting that engagement in the process?
Yeah, so start with the tips, which is make friends with and make use of the heads of department, because if they are bought in, then they'll do the selling job and the engagement thing with their staff. But if they're not interested, it's really hard to get the staff who work for them to be interested against their views on it. So you've got to win the hearts and minds of the heads of department first. And often that's no more than sharing some of this data with the heads of department. I do break out subject-specific summaries for heads of department, and I'm saving them work that they would otherwise either do or feel that they should have done and feel guilty about not having done. So either way, I've got a little bit of a win there because I've provided them with something that they find useful, because they can use that quite quickly to look at their subject as a whole in a year group. They won't be teaching the whole of that year group, so they'll be getting an insight into the students that they don't teach in their department and how they compare to the students they do. So yes, trick there is to make friends with the heads of department. The data that I would share with them, you saw that sort of color-coded matrix, if you like. That's probably the main one to share with them, which is to what extent is each student exceeding, meeting or falling behind their indicated grades in your subject in this year group. So that's the main thing they find useful.
Great. Okay. Doesn't seem we have any more questions from our attendees at the moment. I will share just one more slide. And thank you for taking the time to answer those questions, Andrew. If any more do pop up, then we will, of course, provide responses to them separately. Do let us please have your feedback. I'm sure that there are lots and lots of ways in which our data is being sliced across the country, and we'd love to hear about it. We've got a range of case studies and blogs and other ideas on the news pages of our website. And we also have lots of supporting guidance on our support site. I've mentioned the Assessment Insights team. If you do make use of any of our assessments, be they CAT 4, PASS or any others, then please do reach out to assessment.insights@glassessment.co.uk or gl-assessment.co.uk and arrange to speak with a member of our team. We'd be very, very happy to support you with that. If anything that you've heard today sort of whets your appetite for exploring anything that GL does produce, then do please email me directly, andy.small@gl-assessment.co.uk. The GL data dashboards and this slide and all the slides that you've seen will be shared with you together with the webinar recording. You can learn more about the GL data dashboards both via the link on this slide that will take you to a page of our support sites, but also in your TestWise account. If you are users of 2 or more of our digital tests, the core assessments of CAT 4, PASS, but also our progress tests of English, Maths and Science, or our new group reading test, new group spelling test, then you can have access to these dashboards yourselves. As I say, they are in beta form, so all feedback is welcome. But the idea is that some of the visualizations that Andrew's talked about and other schools across the country are all spending their time, their valuable time developing, we would like to support with. So absolutely, it's something that will evolve over time and hopefully make your data journey far more palatable and allow you to drill down into the data, pose the questions and think about your responses to those questions that come from that data. But otherwise, Andrew, I thank you again for your time and your input. It's really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you to those of you who have given up time at the end of your Monday to attend. And I hope everybody has an enjoyable week ahead as we move through the second half of this autumn term. Thanks very much.